How's it going there, guys? I thought it'd be quite a fun and somewhat different video to jump into some of the gear and choices that I've made over the year with my journey through astronomy visually and then astrophotography too, which naturally followed on. I've been asked this question a few times, kind of what sort of things have I used over the years and maybe what did some of my earlier images look like. I have delved deep into the archives for you, and it's been interesting for me actually going back through these things. It's jogged a lot of old memories, and I'm going to share them with you throughout the course of this video. So I've picked and chose a few select images right here. I'm going to jump through most of them really and give you a little bit of background about where I was at the time and kind of what I was doing with this equipment. So without any further ado, let's just dive straight in with the earliest image I've got of my first proper telescope. So things actually started off looking through a rifle scope, would you believe it, at Jupiter, but after seeing that I decided, right, bigger's got to be better, I want to see more, and I got myself on eBay, I do believe around Christmas 2010 or 2011, something like that, and picked this thing up, which was a Skywatcher 250p, and it's a large Dobsonian telescope. The good thing is, it looked enormous to me at the time, but it was totally manageable. Just by one guy, I could just carry it in and out, no problem whatsoever, and get set up for short sessions. And the fact that is, I didn't know back then about letting the scope cool properly and all that kind of thing. It didn't matter. Ultimately, it did its job. I wanted to see the planets and see some of these deep space objects I'd heard so much about a little bit better. And this scope, for its flaws and certainly for my flaws at the time, I barely knew which end to look through. It did its job. It really, really did. And so I'll always look fondly on that old telescope right there. Bought it used, as I said, on eBay from someone who'd apparently not really used it much at all. It arrived with a great big dint in the side during shipping, but this is the oldest image I can find of it anyway. I was actually obviously taking a picture of one of my old dogs and cats right there, as it happens. But things naturally moved on then. So that was around about 2012 that picture was taken. By 2015, I'd gotten my first actual telescope for astrophotography with that in mind, truly. So an equatorial mount right there. You can see a EQ5 Pro and a Skywatcher Evo Star 120 on there. So this is obviously just the achromatic doublet version. I didn't have an ED scope for some time, actually, but there I am posing with that same cat. Looking rather silly, but this scope really did kick things off a little bit for me because it allowed me to finally share those things I was seeing in much greater detail and be able to show them to other people, namely my mum and dad and then Chloe at the time. And basically that really got the fire lit then because I wanted to see better, I wanted to see more, and I couldn't quite do that with that telescope. So to give you some indication, the first image I ever took in astrophotography was this with a DSLR and just a tripod. So it was a Canon 100D and a 50-300 I think kit lens, something like that. And I'd followed a tutorial on YouTube by Forrest Tanaka, and this was a trip down memory lane on a recent live stream actually where we talked about that. But he basically put together a tutorial for beginners, which I very much was at the time, whereby you could use Deep Sky Stacker, take a bunch of very short photos and stack something up and get an image at the end of it. And I followed his tutorial and I came up with this, and this was my first proper effort at photography, without a telescope rather, but astrophotography in general. And this was 2015, January, I do believe. So that's really when my first actual astro snap was taken. And then moving on to 2015, a little bit later, not very long later at all, I bought myself that telescope. The fire was lit, as I said, and my first actual image of Orion was this one. So you can see it's very colourful and bright, but it did the job. I didn't recognize any of the flaws back then. I didn't know about the noise, I didn't know about the tracking errors, didn't know what chromatic aberration even was. So none of that kind of thing bothered me. I just thought it was amazing that I could see this kind of thing. And again, it urged me to go on and do more. And I was going after other targets around that time. This was my first ever image of the Horsehead and Flame. So Alnitak right there. As you can see, that huge purple glow. That is a star, I promise. But it did its best, and as did I. And ultimately, it led to greater things down the line, I think. Now, obviously, from moving on from this telescope right here, I kept the mount for a little while, but it did have a problem. So to give you some idea, I found this old photo that I'd taken right here. This was 2016. I still had that mount. And you can see it used to have a periodic massive deck error, and it would do this all the time, like clockwork practically. It couldn't be trained out with periodic error correction. It was just a bit too extreme. So ultimately, this led to one of my first DIY attempts to solve a problem with astro gear and strip that mount down, re-grease everything, and reseat everything, really. And it did work. I don't think it was actually perfect, but it certainly wasn't giving total errors of nearly, 3 arc seconds. But it was a massive improvement. It allowed me to move on with things a little bit further on down the line. Now, I did come into possession of a Sigma, I think 150 to 600 or 500 or something like that, lens basically. I think it's a 500 right there. Now, I thought that this was going to be a good step up from the telescope. You can see it's lent over in the corner there in the cluttered kitchen. But the idea was I'd become aware of chromatic aberration a little bit and thought that the lens would sort that because it was an ED lens. However, it certainly didn't. It was ED, I think, in name only, really. It wasn't that good, especially not for stars. The image was pretty poor, and overall it just left me a bit disappointed for astro stuff. It was great fun for daytime photography, don't get me wrong. Really what it's intended for. But for astro stuff, it just wasn't suitable at all. It didn't give me what I wanted. And then, of course, the cogs started whirring towards getting other telescopes and trying to solve the problem that way. But one of the main thing I remember about this lens was every time you'd point it skywards, it would just kind of creep down under its own weight of its end elements. So I had to put a piece of tape over right there to make it stop creeping. Not great, but, you know, I did what I needed. So now, in between that, I owned this telescope right here, which was a Altair 152 doublet achromat, and this was just one of those things where it popped up on actually UK Astro Buy Sell, I do remember, and it was local to me, like very close by. It was within my kind of budget at the time. I just thought, right, this is going to be incredible. I've got to have this thing. Still not really realizing that an achromat wasn't what I wanted, but it looked great. It was certainly big and impressive, and it made my camera look very, very small on the end of it right there. But the pictures it took were, for anybody in the know, these are really intended for solar work, basically with proper filtration. The pictures it took for deep sky though were just terrible for me. I did manage to dig out a couple of those, so bear in mind my image processing too was terrible back then, but this was the triangulum, and the chromatic aberration was just absolutely wild on this thing. Even I knew at that time that something was wrong. It was the Veil Nebula, as all you can see, looking very festive, I'd say, looking at that. Not great, but ultimately, you know, one thing led to another. I determined that the next thing I should really get now would be a mount that could support something perhaps a little bit heavier, because I'd learned a lot about reflectors in my time researching, so I didn't make another large purchasing mistake, and of course that worked out perfectly because I made about 50 more purchasing mistakes down the line, but this right here certainly wasn't among them. This was my Skywatcher EQ6, so actually an EQ6 Pro, and I got this from a chap called Ian Aiken, who was a very experienced astrophotographer at the time. He very kindly took me to into his observatory in his garden and showed me his telescopes and such, and yeah, I remember him well actually. But long story short, he was interested in that Altair scope, and we did some kind of deal, and I ended up giving him some money and got this mount basically. But the step up between these two was just night and day, and not just in weight, but the reliability, really, that night after night reliability that you can kind of expect from an EQ6. And I'll say this image is taken in 2016 right there, and I've still got that mount now, and it's still working perfectly. So there's something to be said for those big old Skywatcher mounts. But yeah, this was absolutely mind-boggling, really, to me. The size difference between the two, I thought it was absolutely incredible. And I'm so glad, so glad I went down that route and got that mount, because it enabled me to do many things that I otherwise couldn't have done. One of which, once I'd financially recovered a little bit, was to get my first kind of reflector telescope. And my word, I went big. So this is my partner Chloe stood next to it right there. This is in 2017, right at the start of the year. And I'd picked up this used Skywatcher Quattro 10-inch. So this was the first of, I'll be honest, many Quattros that I've owned over the years. Initial issues with them was that I couldn't quite get them collimated, not realizing that it was my laser that was at least part of the problem, and then mechanical inadequacies that wouldn't have mattered at that time, I guess, down the line. But that was the other thing holding them back. But there it was with my trusty DSLR on, and Chloe proudly stood next to it for scale. But it was a great introduction, really, to reflectors, in that it kind of jogged me along and made me realize, okay, right, this is certainly more involved than a refractor is, which did two things, really. It made me learn fast as to how to get decent photographs from one of these things, and they were passable at the time to me. But it also really rocked my kind of desire to keep going with reflectors for a bit. So for a good while, I kind of flipped back and forth between reflectors and refractors. To give you an indication of kind of images that I took through that thing early on, which is, I do believe, this one right here. So this was an image of the Orion Nebula, way over processed and stuff like that, and you can see there's twisted veins and a little bit of defocus going on. There's all sorts, but to me at the time this was a massive step up from what I'd previously been taking, so I thought that was, you know, primo. I really enjoyed it. And then I took this image of the core of the Rosette Nebula. Unmodified DSLR, by the way. Just the fact of that 10-inch tube and f4 aperture did let in a lot of light and allowed me to get some, I think, okay images at the time. I mean, it's obviously bad by modern standards, but, you know, at the time, as I said, it did its job and really egged me on, basically. Now, a little bit of time kind of goes on, and by about 2017, I picked up this right here. So I decided I really did want an ED refractor, and it came in the form of this scope right here, Skywatcher Evo Star 80 ED doublet, and I got a unmatched, I will say that, reducer. I actually had two. I had a 0.8 and a 0.6 times reducer, and because I was using a very small camera at the time, this is another thing I've just glossed over. I will jump straight back to it. It didn't really matter. I could use that 0.6 reducer, or so I thought that it didn't matter, and really get some kind of okay images from that rig. Now, the camera in question was this. I had it for a little while. This is an Attic 314L+. It's very much bleached out by the sun and things like that, but it was available, again, semi-locally and within my allocated budget that I was willing to put into this hobby at the time. My word, how things change. But yeah, it came up, and it really did the job. It was a workhorse camera, and it was an immediate step up. Even an old CCD like that, it was a really immediate step up because it was a monochrome CCD. And I also bought some filters along with it, which were the bad original ones, you know, the I think 7nm HSO, and then some LRGB filters alongside. And that was a massively steep learning curve. I don't think I have to hand any of those early images right now. There may be somewhere, but I couldn't find them in time for this. But, you know, the long and short of it is enabling me to experiment then with monochrome imaging and single channels and work through things, because fundamentally not much has actually changed from using this kind of thing to using the monochrome cameras of today. It's really quite similar. The processing software I've used has changed an awful lot, but yeah, there's a lot of similarities also there. Now, moving things along a little bit, I really did enjoy this telescope, and I had it actually a good while, but that was my introduction to a decent quality refractor, and it was a bit of an eye-opening experience, really, because I was getting good image quality without any headaches, which I really rated at the time, just coming off the back of my time with the Quattro right there. Now, I had heard really good things about these. This was a friend who actually put me onto this idea of getting a 150p DS, because these were a slower focal ratio, so these are f5 native, rather than the f4 of the Quattro, as you would expect, meaning f4. And my friend was dead right, actually, when he kind of put me down onto this route of telescopes. So I picked this one up used. Again, pretty much everything I bought back then was used, to be honest with you. It was the most affordable way to do things, because I could pick something up, use it for a while. If I didn't like it, as long as I'd not done anything to it, I could sell it on and try something else. But that was the plan, and I did go through a lot of telescopes, actually even more than I'm going to show you here today. I couldn't find images of absolutely everything, but basically my friend's advice, as it happens, the guy who bought the Quattro off, that he became a friend and offered some advice. And basically it was to pick up an f5 Newtonian reflector along with the coma corrector and things like that, and try that kind of things, because it was much easier to collimate, much more tolerant of mechanical, inadequacies, shall we say. It didn't really matter as much. You could still maintain basically critical collimation at either side of the night sky. It didn't matter. It wasn't going to change much after a flip, basically. And I really, truly enjoyed using these 150 PDSs. I owned a couple of those over the years. Again, I went through a phase of grass always being greener on the other side, so I flip-flopped between all kinds of stuff ultimately, but I did come back to these a couple of times, and even early on in my YouTube career as well. You may note some of my earlier videos, I'm still rocking a 150 PDS in those, and it was with good reason. It really was a capable telescope. Now, this was flooded with other issues at the time, as was the other Newtonian back then. I didn't know, of course, what was causing it, but these are such light, leaky beasts. They need really seaming, like taping up around the seams and blocking up over the back with like a hat, and you name it. There's all sorts of stuff that really needs to be done to get the most out of one of these things from a light polluted, and especially a lot of ambient light location, like I'm imaging from, kitchen lights on, and you name it. But I didn't know, again, at the time, so it didn't really matter. And you will note this was one of my first forays into, along with the change to monochrome, into autofocus. So I was trying to set up more automation, because probably already by now, like 2017, I was getting a little bit sick of being outside with a shutter release for the DSLR and doing things that way. So that side of things didn't last too long. It's okay on a summer night, but my word, 1 or 2 winter nights and you'll soon be you're changing your mind about automation, I would say. Now, this is another scope I came into possession of. This was a 200p, an f5 Newtonian again. This scope didn't get as much use, perhaps, as it deserved, but I did use it for a while. And really the thing that let it down was that, you see, I had this aftermarket focuser on it, and even back then I knew this was going to be a problem, basically, because it wasn't set up right, and I couldn't set it up right. It would just continually slip under, well, just about any load that I put on it. I do remember that quite vividly, and it's made me a touch phobic, I would say, of some Crayford focusers going on even from this kind of time frame. But you live and you learn, and I'm sure there's good Crayfords out there. In fact, I did try a later Quattro with a moonlight on, which was pretty good, as it happens. You will note also around this time I did start to get into a little bit more DIY stuff. So here I'd rigged up along the top of the vane there, a pair of wires into a series resistor dew heater to try and keep the dew off of that secondary mirror right there. Next up came projects with the primary, but that was a big step because that was always the first thing that went for me. Interestingly, the secondary would dew up before that primary. But that was a solution, and again, it was just one of those things where, really lack of money, I suppose, to spend on peripherals, on scopes that I wasn't actually sure I was going to keep, put me off having to buy a secondary, heaters and dew straps and all that kinds of things. I've just found ways to do things myself using tutorials online and other, knowledge. Other than that, now, around about 2018, you can see we've just got started really in 2018 there. I picked up this, so it was quite a big step up from that 314L camera by Attic, and this was a QHY163 monochrome. Now, I did use the same filter wheel from the Attic. I just got rid of the camera itself. And I used this for a little while, and this again transformed what I felt was possible from my backyard. Now, obviously, that's continually changed as time goes on. And, if I used this camera again now, I'd take even better images, of course. But it's, at the time, just moving from older CCD to much newer, back then, QHY163 with one of those Panasonic sensors in, major step up, and it was really worth every penny. And I did take some images that I felt like I was happy enough with to actually put them on the wall. And around that time also, this one's 2018, this image was taken from, I do believe I got this scope around about that time. This was an Evo Star 72 ED, and that was the first new telescope that I ever bought. Or rather, should I say, was bought for me in this case. Still, I was using, DIY dew heater on the end right there and stuff like that, but it didn't matter. It all worked, and it worked well. The focuser was good enough, even though it's another traditionally quite slippery Crayford, but this was, adjustable enough that it would hold. I could automate, and I could, really dig in and get some decent shots with this thing. And you can see that QHY on the back there, that quantum filter wheel that I used to use. I've got a little bit better at cable management, put some sleeving on and things like that. Things were moving along. I'd also done another big DIY project where I'd kind of made this pier because I got sick of carrying the tripod in and out, and I wanted to get a little bit higher than the tripod would allow. So I made quite a tall pier with a very cobbled together connection system. But again, it worked. It was enough. It got me looking at the targets that I wanted to see. So that was a major win. And talking about those images that I'd taken, so around about 2018, these were ones that I felt like were a big step up, good enough for me to actually, go ahead and send them off for print, basically, and get them back. And you can see now, yeah, they're not amazing, but they were okay. And they're certainly, I felt they were pretty good back then, and there they were on the house wall. That was a good step along. Now, I did always miss one-shot color, and this is something that's continued, by the way, right from 2018 here to modern day. So I thought at the time there was a good deal with QHY cameras, so I'd saved up, I'd sold that other monochrome camera, and I decided that I wanted to move to the 183 sensors in particular. And I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world, but over here in the UK, you could buy a QHY 183 mono and get the color for half price. And so I did. Basically, that was the deal I got. It was the color camera right there. I did have the mono as well at the same time, but these two, having them both at the same time, allowed me to start something that would continue on with me, really, which was the interest in experimentation and side-by-sides. And as you can imagine, when you've got two identical cameras, you are going to want to compare them. I think that's only natural to do, and that's exactly what I did. So starting with these came a lot of experimentation then, where I'd be testing out, okay, I'm going to try mono now, and then I'm going to try color, and I feel like I learned a lot around about that time. I did also come into possession of a Newtonian tube with no dovetail or anything like that, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this thing? And I'd missed my old Dobsonian, so out came the woodworking tools and some scrap MDF, totally the wrong material, by the way, but I just wanted a Dobsonian to work with, and I made this thing right here. It's a little bit rough, but it was all right, and it allowed me to look through. You can see I've got an eyepiece in it right there, and that was the long pier that I talked about. So this is 4 by 4s, something like that. cemented into a huge plant pot. So I recently, only very recently, threw this thing away, and it was so heavy. To get it into a skip, it took a lot, basically. But yeah, it wasn't going anywhere, and it was a decent project, as it happens, as was this. Just one of those things I ended up doing. I thought it might be fun to show you that, a little bit of DIY Dobson action. But moving on, anyway, I went back down Newtown, and at this time you can also see I cut this pier down as things were getting a little bit too precarious to lift stuff on, especially once the rig started to grow a little bit. Now, this was my first ever carbon scopes. This was a 8-inch carbon quattro, and you can see I've got the color camera on, and I'm doing some I'm getting ready to do some imaging anyway with my old laptop right there on the power bank box that I had with a huge marine battery inside. I used to carry that thing in and out. It did a good job, at least in warmer weather. And you can see on top of this, I'd actually mounted in its rings my Evo Star 72 ED as well, and that was acting as the guide scope, so a good 430-ish mil focal length guide scope. Good combo, actually, to be honest. The EQ6 handled it well. You can see it didn't take too much counterweight to balance it out. And I did have some fun with this thing. I will say the carbon tube was pretty much for show only, I think, on these early Quattros. It looks nice, don't get me wrong, but it was single, very slim construction, and I would have probably just rather had a steel tube at the end of the day. But there it was. Again, this was another foray down Newt Avenue. Now, after a little time with that, around 2019 now, I decided to get my first big glass. So I remember there was someone posting on Cloudy Nights forums a lot called, I think, James 7CA, and he'd got a Teleview NP127. Nagler Petsville, I think it stands for NP. Anyway, beautiful telescope, and not at all like this telescope that I ended up with, but it was enough to make me think, all right, if he's doing that with a 5-inch refractor, then I need a 5-inch refractor. This was the one that I could afford at the time. And honestly, when I got it, it was way out. It was, so normally triplets and stuff stay in collimation quite well. This, it was a mess. It needed recollimating, so it took some trial and error and moving things around, and I don't know where I got the bravery actually to even bother trying to collimate a triplet, but I felt like I was left with no option. I couldn't, in any good consciousness, sell that scope on to anybody, so I felt like I had to do something. I was almost too embarrassed to kind of tell my dad and stuff, who'd actually drove me to buy this thing, that there was a problem with the scope as well, and I couldn't be sure maybe that the guy who sold me even knew anything was wrong. But anyway, long story short, I did end up solving it. The middle element kind of came loose, so I did collimate it and sold it on, eventually fixed. That was a bit of a relief, otherwise I'd have been majorly in the hole with that one. But again, it was in the end a good experience with a big Apo, even though it was only really the equivalent of an FPL 51 Apo, I do believe. It wasn't anything amazing, but it was enough. Now, around about 2019, this was another local listing that appeared. So you can see mounted on that, now looking very small, EQ6 is a very, very big telescope, and that was the Skywatcher 300 PDS. And the reason I'd got this is because I'd started seeing images, again, from this is influence from the outside, a chap called Xax, and his images doing lucky imaging really inspired me to want to try bigger aperture, kind of Newtonian approaches, and that's where this came about. Now, once I'd got this scope, honestly, I didn't expect it to be anywhere near as big as it was. When I finally arrived, I thought, my word, what I'm going to do with that thing. But I'll tell you what I did with that thing. I had a lot of fun, to be honest with you. It wasn't one of those things you could just whip outside and it was immediately usable. It did start to take some time to cool, and it did take a little bit of planning actually to get it out there, set up and safe. You can see the size difference here. I put these two side by side. So that's the 300 PDS on the floor next to the dog balls, but mounted on top, not mounted, but rather sat on top, is a Skywatcher 150 PDS, and you can see the size difference between these two. It's it looks like an adult with its infant child. It's ridiculous. You wouldn't think that going from the 150 to the 300 would be such a leap, but it really, really was. I do believe I've got another shot of that stood next to a 250, I think, or something like that as well. I'll have to see if that's a roundabout on here for you. Here we are. So this is another 300 PDS that I had, but this is one where I had a 250 at the same time, just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. Well, a 250 PDS is a big scope, but the 300 was just almost beyond a joke. It was so large. In fact, here is my sister, one of my sisters anyway, stood next to it, and it looks like you could, load her in and launch her across the house like it's some sort of fairground equipment. But it was a lot of fun ultimately, and it allowed me to start doing some deep space lucky imaging. And this was one of the wins at the time. It might not look like that much right now, but this was the 183 mono. cropped in, sharp cap live stacking, and I caught, of course, the chord of the Cat's Eye Nebula, and that to me was magic. Back then, I was so impressed. The thing that I really didn't like, of course, was just how difficult it was to get set up with that thing. Bear in mind, I have to do everything on my own. So, yeah, it wasn't really for the faint of heart, because when that thing was all rigged up and ready to go, it was kind of awkward. Not just heavy, it's like 70 pounds once it was all loaded up and ready to go, which isn't that bad on its own. But the length and overall shape of it, it's like trying to move a couch or something. It's not so heavy, but the size just makes it awkward. That's the the key takeaway. So as you can see, anyway, back in 2019, a little bit later on in the year, I was back to now with a hat on to block out some of that stray light, 150 PDS, and around about this time I switched to ZWO cameras, I do believe. So this was a 533, I think, on this, or maybe a 294. I had both. I definitely liked the 533 more though back then. But again, this was another step in the right direction, and I felt like I started getting good images by then. Now, another big thing happened around about 2019, not the thing you're thinking, but I got my first 3D printer, and of course the first things that I started printing, astro gear. So I was designing and making stuff to solve some of the problems that I mentioned before about Newtonians. So that looked something like this, just held on with double-sided Velcro tape, and definitely not a shock and fire hazard, but there you have it. It worked. It did keep the dew off the primary mirror, as it was continually kept at ambient rather than being allowed to dip below through radiative cooling. I did eventually neaten up that design and go with a much smaller, less prone to burst into flames design right there, with a CPU cooler fan, and designed a cowling system too for it, which forced the airflow over the mirror, and as it coincides with each other, it starts to spin a little bit like a tornado kind of thing, and it really worked well. So these two little bits of kit side by side, solved all the dew issues that I'd ever been having. So I really did enjoy them, though, that Newtonian and the other ones that I had, especially once I got a printer and could start solving the problems with the little bit of good old-fashioned ingenuity. Now, I did get this about 2020. I'm getting a little bit later on now here, but Scouch Esprit 80ED. This was my first true high quality Apo triplet, and I loved it. You know what I mean? It was a bit of an eye-opening telescope as to just how kind of pain-free things could have been all that time. I think we was running into the sort of period in time where maybe my gear right there was a little bit better than my skill still was in terms of processing. I think it was okay at capture, but the processing left something to be desired definitely back then. But this was definitely with a 533 on it, a filter draw. I remember experimenting with light pollution filters and such at the time and didn't really enjoy them. Done further experimentation since and still don't enjoy them very much. But also around this time I started to get interested in trying to make video edits and stuff like that, and this was one of my first attempts, and I was like, oh god, I can't believe what this is. But 2020, 17th of the 4th right there. Good bit of fun. This was a bit before I started actually making stuff on YouTube, of course, but I did make a practice video for myself kind of thing, just to see what it was like. But here was that rig in action, and one of the famous chairs from back on early in my YouTube career right there. Went through a couple more telescopes. I had this very briefly for a while, another little F4 Newtonian. This was a telescope service one. Didn't have it for long, to be honest. Didn't really rate it at all, so off that went. This was a big step up. Now this really was a big step up. You can see this is back in 2020, 27th of the 10th. Here I am outside with the most famous of the chairs. I'll be impressed if anybody's still watching, but if anybody is still watching and remembers that chair, then crikey, type down below, let me know. I'd get a kick out of that one. But this was a Celestron Edge HD 8 with a moonlight focuser on the thing, and this was a revelation around that time. So my first real efforts in very long focal length imaging, even longer than the huge 300 PDS that we noted before. Totally wrong guide scope system, but it worked okay, and I did have a lot of fun with this rig. I probably wish I'd have had more money at the time and could have potentially kept that Edge HD 8, as it was a fine bit of kit, and certainly I'm sure I could have found some uses for it today, but there it was. There's Orion and the moon, Taurus, Pleiades. Just a fantastic old image, brings back some good memories, I would say. Now, for a while again, I did go back down to Refractor Town, and here we are with the Sharpstar 100Q2 Apo with a QHY 163 and a matching CFW3 or something like that filter wheel from them. This I purchased for myself, brand new, near Christmas. You can see all the Christmas decorations, of course. I wasn't happy with it in the slightest, to be honest with you. I'd seen a lot of things about it online that said it looked great. I felt it was really, really soft and mushy on the optics. So yeah, I sent it back. Basically, I just provided what I felt was good evidence to the vendor, and they were okay with it. They were really good to deal with, actually. But yeah, sent it back and moved on swiftly from that, and ended up afterwards with another good decision in my astro equipment. So this was the Skywatcher Esprit 120 AD. So I picked this up used, probably not too long after sending that scope back, to be honest with you. But an ED 120 there, f7. So this is a truly high quality triplet. Mechanical quality overall in terms of like the focus and stuff like that is good, and the build overall is good. The only thing that let these Esprits down for me is the dew shield flop, but I think they've redesigned them now these days, so that's probably sorted. I would have hoped so anyway, but yeah, I kept this scope for a good long while, and my word, did I enjoy it. I never felt like it was holding me back. That was one of the things that was key about it. I could get it out and just know that I was, I was probably going to be the limiting factor, or the seeing, or something like that. Not really the scope anymore at that time. So even though it cost me an awful lot of money to me, it was worth it, and I really enjoyed my time with that telescope. Now, around about here is where Chloe started getting into astrophotography too. So you can see the second rig I'd got set up right there with like a laser surveying tripod and an AZ GTI that I'd picked up used again, just with a DSLR over there. Now, changed DSLRs by this point. This was a Canon 700D Astro modified. So while I was running my rig, Chloe was actually going to start using that a little bit more, and then things progressed because she was actually enjoying using that, and eventually, don't know if it's on this photo, I think it is, here she is with the first proper rig. So this was that same AZ GTI, shorter counterweight and stuff, same camera, but with a guide scope next to it and an ASI Air. So the first version, the one's in the plastic body with the little discrete power, I think, step down box or something like that you used to have to put in line with them. This was with a Rokinon 135 that she'd also bought for herself, so she really started taking it quite seriously around this time, and I think the results were such that she reinvested even more. Ended up getting, when these came out, the Skywatcher ASI Air Pro, I think, back then. The ones that had a little bit iffy Wi-Fi, but it was good enough. Proper little discrete guide scope there, and the Red Cat. And you can see I've got my camera on it back then, so the 2600. Just overall, a hell of a lot of fun. Would still be a great fun rig to use right now. Do you know what I mean? And this was back in 2021, so yeah, it was pretty nearly bleeding edge stuff, I would have said. That's a 2600 MC and a Red Cat. That was certainly a good rig for the time. I'm just trying to move on to my next shot. So you probably might even remember the YouTube video, some of you, if you've been watching the channel for a while. I picked up my first heavy duty mount right there. So this was a Skywatcher EQ8. Chloe helped me to buy that, and yeah, major thanks to Chloe for that one. But I really felt like the mount, the EQ6, wasn't holding me back as such, but at least on nights that weren't perfect, the EQ8 could certainly hold something like that 250 PDS in a mild breeze, no problem whatsoever, whereas the EQ6 would have been a little bit, wobbling around. And it just basically gave me, it was the gift of more usable nights per year with the scopes that I had, which was fantastic. Again, still using ASI Air at this time, so I'd got the ASI Air Plus, I do believe, and still really rate that thing. I've got it here in the observatory with me, and I'm looking for something I can basically put it on, really. But some of the modern cameras that I'm using now, the 2600 Air, for example, already has that kind of stuff built in, so maybe it's not that needed anymore. But here that rig is, once again, just fantastic. Really enjoyed that thing. That same 300 and 250 PDS shot for contrast. Absolutely ridiculous difference there. And then really we're getting on to quite modern stuff. So, of course, I started my YouTube channel around about 2021, and one of the first people to ever leave a comment on my YouTube channel was my friend Bill Blanchard. Right on my first video, actually. There's a comment there from him. Anyway, long story short, we did get talking, and we're good friends. And he ended up selling me his Rasa 8 and shipping it all the way from Texas. And again, this was one of those things where I wish I had more money, because I used this scope for a long time. I really enjoyed it, and I would have loved to have kept it, but it just so happened that another one of my friends was looking for a Rasa 8. He had a Rasa 11 V2, and a deal was in the making. I got in contact with Bill and said, "Listen, Bill, is it okay if I was to trade this up?" kind of thing. And he's like, "Just do it, man. Go for it." And so I got the green light from a friend. I wouldn't have felt right doing it without that. But yeah, that is now still in his possession. I had his Raster 11 V2 for a good long while. Really enjoyed that telescope, to be honest, as well. But the Raster 8 was, I feel like, the better of them. It was just a little bit less hassle overall, shall we say. Another foray into long focal length stuff right here. So this is a Schmidt Cassegrain Meade LX200 EMC. So quite an old telescope. Still put up a fine image, I would have said. And here's Chloe using it a little bit visually. We were looking at Jupiter on this night. I remember it quite well. Well, I should say this morning. But yeah, it was... It's one of those things where it almost felt like it would have been worth hanging on to it, given the price that I'd paid and things like that, and what I got for it ultimately when I sold it. But you've only got finite room and really only so many scopes you can actually feasibly use. So that eventually went. And here we are now looking into the observatory, back on with the Raster once more. My old dog Henry there. Another scope I owned, the Scoutcher Skymax 180. Still got it, of course. I actually just used it a few nights ago to show a friend Saturn and its nearly flat rings at this point in time, as of course, recording. It's this kind of year that they're just about flat on. Again, a lot of fun. I still get a kick out of visual. It's really the thing that kicked it all off. If you were watching at the start of this video, visual got me started and still keeps me going a little bit now. I do like a look through it. This was another opportunity that came along to purchase an ASCII 120 Apo direct from manufacturer for review. Took it and really bloody enjoyed it. I'll be honest with you, I liked that scope a lot. But then down the line, you know, more opportunities come along, more scopes for review, and we're left with the current crop, really. So here's the Celestron Edge HD 11 that I've got right there. So that's that rig on the EQ8 that we're still using. Still the original EQ6 that we were talking about before, now with an SQA 106 mounted on it. And just at the bottom there, we can get you a view of that rather. The ASCII SQA 55, and I'm really enjoying all those scopes, to be honest, right now. And I could do with a bit of a clear out of some of the other stuff that I've still got. But yeah, overall, been a decent old trip down memory lane, but I hope that you've enjoyed it. I certainly have enjoyed looking back at some of the scopes that I've had. This actually wasn't everything that I'd owned. I went through a few Richard Gretians. I've had other scopes here on loan as well that I haven't covered on this, but you know, it's most of the scopes. And yeah, I've enjoyed it. Hopefully you've enjoyed seeing a little bit of the history behind things, and hopefully looking at some of my later images, you can see how things have progressed from the very early stuff, my first image, 2015, to slightly later, 2016 to 2019 or something like that, to now modern day. I don't have an Orion image to show you from this year, but there is one on the channel from just last year. Big changes. So, you know, it's not only me that's changed in the scopes, but what we can do has too. So it's a continual journey. I'm enjoying it. Yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. So thank you very much indeed for watching. And yeah, I'd love to hear your comments, any thoughts you have on anything like that. It's always a blast to contact with you guys. So yeah, look after yourselves. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, clear skies.